So, Imrith, you're going to be taking us through July's leaderboard today. Obviously, June had the highest battery revenues we've ever seen in GB across a month. So, what happened this month? For a start, let's have a look at wholesale spreads.
So wholesale spreads were pretty interesting this month, especially because we saw that huge spread on the 18th of July when we had the really hot heat wave.
Which we did the article about and the video about previously.
Yeah, which I recommend anyone to check out if they haven't managed to read it yet. But there was a spread available of over £500 per megawatt hour, which is pretty crazy considering we're in July.
I mean, even without that, right? These are really high wholesale spreads for a normal July anyway.
Yeah, definitely. If you take a look at that piece, you can see how assets operated on that day.
Cool. So let's have a look what was going on in the balancing mechanism for BESS this month.
Yeah, so BM activity is still quite low in the BM. We can see 2 days there that are highlighted on the graph, the 11th of July, where a lot of assets were turned down, and the 19th of July, so that was the second day of the heat wave, where there was quite a lot of assets turned up in the BM. And we'll go and dive into one specific asset at the end of this video and look at its operational profile for that day.
Okay, let's have a look at frequency response then, because frequency response been the main markets for batteries since they got brought in. So what's been happening in the dynamic suite?
So DC clearing prices have remained pretty high, or very high actually, in DC low especially. So we're looking at the second highest month. So just below last month's clearing prices, where we saw record high revenues across all assets. And then DR, we can see that the DR high is cleared at an all-time high on average, and generally the prices are very, very good, remaining pretty similar to what they have done since April.
It's quite interesting looking at this graph, right? Because if you look at since when DR was launched, there seems to be not much gap between the low and high service. In fact, even in May, we saw that the low service was more lucrative than the high service. But this month, there's a bit more disparity between revenues in the high and low service. So why is that?
Well, I'm not sure of the full reason, but what I can tell you is it's very interesting that is the case, because a lot more capacity has been procured in the high service.
Okay.
And that's especially because of the Harmony Tesla assets that have been pursuing a very aggressive strategy of providing DR, the high service, on its own, and then dispatching in wholesale markets. So actually in DR high, there was around 3,500 megawatts procured throughout the month, and in DR low, there was only around 800 megawatts.
Okay, yeah, that's a massive gap.
And then DM, very low participation in that service, around 100 megawatts across the whole month, across all assets, and prices remain quite low as they have since its launch.
Okay, so let's have a look at average overall fleet revenues this month.
So revenues are still very high. We have a 20% drop off from last month, but I think last month was obviously just a bit out of this world. We saw some really high revenues across all assets, and that really goes back to when we look at that dynamic containment average clearing price graph, we saw how high it cleared last month. And so really this month it's dropped off for two reasons. So we saw just before on that graph, we saw the average clearing price had dropped a little bit, but also assets weren't accepted as often as they were last month, where volume requirements were slightly higher.
Okay.
So a mixture of slightly lower prices and slightly less acceptance have led to revenues dropping off from last month, but we can still see they remain very high.
And it's also worth mentioning, right, if we look at the red on that graph, that's FFR, monthly FFR. We know that in July, the ESO, kind of without people anticipating it, they dropped their volume requirements in EFAs 5 and 6 from 550 megawatts to 350. And what that meant was there was a bit of a price pinch in July. We've just seen the August auctions, and we know they've rebounded. Revenues have rebounded a bit in FFR. So that FFR bar will be taller next month as well.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, because that feeds into the reason that the revenues have dropped slightly, because of the decrease in volume requirements in FFR, there's been an increase in competition in DC low, which goes to explain why there has been assets being accepted less of the time. So there's a few days where we see assets without an EFA block of participation in any frequency response service.
Cool. So let's have a look at what assets were doing based on the markets they participated in.
So look, quite like last month, we can see that if we start from the left, assets that solely provided FFR remain quite low in terms of their average revenues when compared to the rest of the fleet. we can see that assets that solely provided some of the dynamic services were once again rewarded for exposing themselves to how volatile the markets are currently. And that's really, we can see the lowest revenue sitting at around £15,000 per megawatt, which is pretty incredible because that's basically the revenue benchmark that assets were once earning a year ago when all assets were getting £17 per megawatt for full availability and participation in DC. And then we can see when we look on the far right, dynamic services and FFR, this is an assets that have taken a bit of a hybrid strategy and basically booked themselves in to provide FFR in certain ether blocks throughout the month and then expose themselves to the dynamic services. But once again, those assets generally are sitting just below those assets that solely provided some of the dynamic services.
Cool, yeah, and it's really obvious just from looking at that how much more lucrative those dynamic services were this month than that FFR.
Cool.